I'm Jessica Jordan. You're listening to American Edition on the Voice of Russia. Well, as we've been discussing, today marks 11 years since the September 11th attacks in 2001. And in response, the presidential candidates are taking a break from campaigning. President Obama and Mitt Romney have pulled their negative ads and will not appear at campaign rallies today in honor of the anniversary. But the American Islamic Forum for Democracy is calling on Obama and Romney to use the 11th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks to re-engage the national discussion into the root causes of the terror attacks. I'm on the line with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He's also author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, thanks so much for joining me again.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So what do you believe still needs to be done to address really the root of the 9/11 attacks?
Well, I think so far counterterrorism has simply been dealing with, and admittedly this is what the government calls it, they call it violent extremism. And violence is just one of the symptoms of an underlying ideology, and that ideology, as our Muslim organization identifies it, is Islamism or political Islam. The construct that the state should have a religious Islamic identity that is founded in a legal system based in Sharia, and that ultimately that is better than any other system. And as a Muslim that's devout, and my family escaped Syria and came to the U.S. and has been able to practice our faith more freely here than ever anywhere else in the world, we truly believe that Islamism is not only not as good as the West, but is a totalitarian system that allows theocrats to control. And whether it's bin Laden or the head of the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas or Hezbollah or the Khomeinists in Iran, these are all byproducts of a political Islamist system that ultimately, whether violent or nonviolent, is incompatible with freedom and liberty.
There's so many hurdles to face, though, I'm thinking, in trying to get that message across here and to even re-engage the public in talking about this. And also, on the flip side of that, battling Islamophobia, which exists here in the U.S.
Well, again, we can't allow political correctness and the groups that thrive on Islamism, whether it's the Council on American Islamic Relations or the Muslim Public Affairs Council, all of these Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups that came to the West and sort of under the radar used other names that are using the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood to pretend to represent us as Muslims when in fact they represent a segment of Muslims, which are the Islamists, have been able to protect themselves from any critique, because in the West, critique of a religious ideology is thought to be anti-religious. And in fact, if you look at the founding fathers, Jefferson and Madison had a lot of discussion of the need. I mean, if you look at our founding documents, the word Christian is not included there because they had an open discussion about the threat of theocracy if you empowered clerics and priests in the Church of England. And I think similarly, Muslims should be able to, in the free world, have a discussion about the fact that we can separate Islam as a personal faith between me and God versus Islam as a doctrine of Sharia and government and as a doctrine that is supremacist, in which other faiths get their rights from Islam rather than rights from God, which is, I think, a better description as we see in American government.
What do you think are the biggest hurdles in making that transition?
I think number one is for America to start to realize, as you see now in Egypt and Iran and elsewhere, that in Muslim majority countries, there's a lot of diversity between not only left and right, from communist socialist to conservative free market, but within the faith community, there are secularists, there are theocrats, and then there are those that want the separation of mosque and state. In America, because Muslims are a minority, our discussion of Islam has become a ping pong ball for the election cycle. So as a result, one party feels that America is Islamophobic and they need to protect minority rights. The other party sometimes will use it to say that they're part of national security and are stronger on the threat of radicalism. And lost in the whole discussion is that the American Muslim population of 4 to 5 million Muslims, which are a small number, but can have a huge role globally in beginning to push forth the ideas. And I talk about this in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, where I say American Muslims and our work of reform and modernization, pushing back against Muslim Brotherhood ideas, is the most obvious and easiest place to do this work. And yet we've had so many obstacles because the political environment is such that Muslims are used as a minority group rather than somehow we think alike, rather than actually a diverse group that has so many competing ideas that need to marginalize the old medieval thinkers that still are controlling a lot of the major Muslim organizations.
Don't we really need to look at, though, don't we need to really look at extremists, though, in these cases and sort of differentiate what's going on here in the U.S. in terms of explaining the fact that these are extremists that are taking part in the violence?
Well, I think obviously from the military, homeland security standpoint, yes, that should be their focus. And I have a chapter I talk about Nidal Hassan, and here you have a psychiatrist, was an army psychiatrist, committed the most vicious act on our soil since 9/11. He didn't spontaneously arise out of nowhere. His ideas were slowly radicalized over a generation of his, even while he was in the army, and yet he didn't end up one night talking to Awlaki out of nowhere. Imam Awlaki was a natural part of the pathway of evolving out of ideas of organizations that say America's anti-Muslim, America's anti-Islam, that America's part of some Zionist conspiracy theory, et cetera, et cetera. If our homeland security only addresses the violent part, if our homeland security only addresses the violent part, and we as Muslims and think tanks and elsewhere don't address the Islamism, the nonviolent precursor to the violent final pathway, it'll be a whack-a-mole program. And if you look at the last 250 arrests on terrorism in the United States, 190 were Muslims. So you have 1% of the population providing 85% of the terror arrests. You have to realize that, yes, I love my faith, and part of that tough love is for us to realize that we have a radicalization problem. We have a problem with our community coming to terms with Western society, and the way to confront that is head on and not through apologetics. I'm an Orthodox Muslim. I pray 5 times a day, fast, to raise my kids to read Scripture and learn their language and understand the traditions of the Prophet. But just like the West went through a separation of church and state and the defeat of theocracy, we as Muslims need to confront the real root causes of radicalism. And you see now in Egypt, yes, the Brotherhood took over, but the first round of elections, they were only 25% of the vote, and then they won a runoff. And the vast majority of people that started that Arab Spring were not Islamists. The Islamists took it over because they were the most well-organized, etc., while the secularists were all divided into 70 different parties. So, we need to unify the voices of liberty and freedom in order to have an equal counter to the Islamist movements that are so well unified and basically only have 2 divisions between the Islamists and the more extreme Salafists.
What do you believe is the first step, though, to take here in the U.S. in terms of the presidential candidates? You said the presidential candidate should step up and get the conversation going.
Just like in the era of the Cold War, we had President Reagan that was courageous enough to talk about the Soviet Union being the evil empire and communism being an ideology that was incompatible with freedom and free markets, and that ultimately capitalism and free markets would this was not a military conflict against the Soviets, it was an ideological one. That type of leadership now, I think, needs to happen, in which we realize that we have an OIC of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation that includes 56 countries that are Muslim majority that share, they're basically a group of autocrats and dictators, and there's been no clarity, and we need a liberty doctrine in the Middle East in which we in the West and the free world start saying that we're going to take sides within the House of Islam, and that this battle that I talk about in my book happening within the House of Islam is not just, let the Muslims fight it out. We need to say, we're going to work with Muslims that recognize that Jews and Christians and all faiths, including atheists and people of non-faith, have equal access to government, and that they don't need theocracy, and that we can take those sides. And that can happen from Washington, from the president on down, to say that our quarrel is not with Islam, but it is with Islamist movement.
We've been speaking with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. I've been speaking with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He's founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and he's author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.